Great.
We are living in challenging times. Politics is polarizing. Racism is rampant. The pandemic is frightening. And families are divided. Tough times require more dialogue and more understanding. But navigating our differences constructively is hard work. Delta Dental believes that healthy, smart, vibrant communities are also civil and harmonious. They are places where disagreement does not have to be toxic or destructive. Civility starts with listening. Welcome to the Civility Project.
So we're very grateful to Delta Dental for making this possible. Thanks to their generosity, we have been able to bring programs to organizations like yours across the country this year and work with thousands of people. So that's really exciting. And so what I'd like to do is start with Stephen and Nolan introducing themselves and how the Civility Project came to be. And then we will dive into some more specific subject matter. And throughout the next hour that we're together, if you have questions that you'd like them to answer, please put them in the chat. I'll make sure to take them in the order that they come. And we will hopefully be able to open this up for discussion at the end. So Stephen and Nolan, if you'd like to start, tell us a little bit about both of you and what the Civility Project is and what we're hoping to do.
Nolan, why don't you start?
Yeah, Steve and I are, longtime Detroit journalists. When we met, Steve was working on the editorial page editorial page of the Detroit Free Press, and he later became editor of that page. I've been the editorial page editor of the Detroit News for 20 years. Ours is a conservative paper. He worked at the Free Press. It was a progressive paper. He's gone on to do other things in the media, but we still frequently are called on to speak together, to provide sort of a counterpoint on political issues. We're on TV together at least once a week and on a regular show, and then on other occasions. And we've been doing it for about 10, 12 years now. And we found out very quickly that we could get together on these programs where people intentionally put you together to watch you fight, and have very passionate, intense discussions and still walk away feeling pretty good about each other and still walking away as friends. And that never really surprised us all that much, but it sure seemed to surprise a lot of other people and disappoint some who didn't think that people who felt so passionately about politics and policy should be able to also maintain a positive friendship. And so, we got to thinking about that and talking with it about people and trying to, we started out, somebody mentioned the Heritage Distillery. Well, we started out having whiskey nights, bourbon nights, where he'd bring some of his friends and I'd bring some of my friends. And we'd just ask people to get together and talk, not about their differences, but about the things they had in common, in hopes of building trust to get to the point of being able to converse and discuss and to perhaps even work together toward solutions to our common problems. I'll let Steve take it from there.
And so, in addition to the fact that Nolan and I have been able to kind of work that out and be able to have debates and arguments without it becoming so bitter that we can't, stand each other or deal with each other in other contexts. Over the last 4 or 5 years, everything around us has also really changed in terms of the way that other people do that. If you think about the way that public discourse and public debate has really declined in the last certainly in the last 5 years. I would say it's probably a little longer than that. But the last 5 years have been really dramatic in terms of the way that that people are not just unable to do it, but unwilling to do it. And the sort of rise and popularity of uncivil discourse and exchanges, it really started to make us think about the value of what we're able to do and what we have, and the opportunity to try to share that with more people as a way of trying to encourage people to re-engage in the sort of public square in a way that is more civil and more productive, and less bitter and full of anger. And so over the last few years, we have decided that sharing some of the things that we've done, sharing some of the things that we've learned, and getting other people to do some of those things really was a way to try to turn things in a different direction in terms of debate and discourse.
And as Steve said, it has really gotten to the point in this country where this divide has become so bitter and so hateful that you wonder if we can ever come together as a nation to address the common issues and threats that confront us, and to have the sort of meaningful problem-solving discussions that a democratic society must have. And I saw a poll out of, just to put the problem in context, I saw a poll out of New Hampshire this morning where that said 40% of Republicans in that state, 20% of Democrats are afraid to express their political views, to tell people what their politics are, what their views are, and they won't engage in those conversations, even with acquaintances. And 70% of Republicans, and I forget the number for Democrats, but it was a high number, also said they only have friends who agree with them. And there's a danger in both of those findings. So, I mean, first, you don't want people afraid to have interchanges, to have discourse. That should never be the case in a society that depends on discourse to come to solutions. And you certainly shouldn't be isolating yourself only to people who think like you do and who agree with you. That just exasperates the divide, I think. And it also leads to this dehumanization of people and the hate, dehumanization of people who don't agree with you. And it becomes easier to look at them as less than, equal to you, or as important and meaningful as you. And you run into all sorts of problems. We've seen that throughout history when we engage in that level of dehumanization. And it is entirely possible here. I mean, we've certainly been there before, and still struggling to get past that. But fueling this political divide with misconceptions, assumptions about other people who we don't really bother to get to know, I think is not healthy for us as individuals, certainly not as a people. And that's basically why we started this project with the help of Delta Dental, whom we thank very much for their support. And, we've been talking to groups like yours just to sort of share some of our tips for having a civil discussion, but also for talking about the importance of it and why you should do it, even when you might find it more comfortable not to engage with people you disagree with.
Those are great points. And actually, you've provided a wonderful transition to the next topic, Nolan, which is how do we go about this? And so, in our time together, we'll talk about tips for building civility, which we actually continue the conversation in a monthly newsletter. So if you would like to add your name to our list, please put your email in the chat and I'll make sure to get you guys on there. But, how do we do this day to day in our personal relationships, professional relationships, in the community at large? And then later on, we'll talk about, how do we build civility in more complicated times? So
Right.
guys, where can we begin? How do we build civility? What are some easy steps?
Starts with trust, and that was our point in bringing people together. I'll let Steve talk about our own experience in building trust and familiarity through the StoryCorps projects on NPR. But it starts with building trust, getting to know people, taking the time to view people as something other than their politics. So to get together and ask people what drives their opinion forming process. It's our belief that most people come to their opinions in the same way. They take the facts, the information, the data, apply their own personal experiences to it, their own values to it, and come up with an opinion. And if they come up with an opinion different than yours, it doesn't make them evil. It doesn't make them awful people. It doesn't mean they hate their country. It just means they've had different different life experiences, and that can change over time, and probably ought to as your experiences change. But it really does start with trust and familiarity, and getting to know people and view people as people and not as their politics.
Yeah. And the experience for us that I think really opened our eyes to the idea that if you back away from politics, if you back away from the differences that you have with somebody over politics, and really talk about who you are and where your ideas come from, it makes a different kind of exchange possible. And for Nolan and I, that happened a few years ago here in Detroit when the NPR project called StoryCorps came to town. And for those who are unfamiliar, this is NPR's effort to capture and kind of archive stories about American relationships. People go down and sit together for about an hour and just talk about the interaction between them and what it's like now and sort of how it evolved over time. And lots of people have done that with family members. People do it with spouses. When NPR came to Detroit, I said, I want to take Nolan with me down to StoryCorps. And I told him that what I wanted us to talk about was not the things that we argue about on TV or on panels or things like that. I wanted us to talk about where our ideas come from. Why does he consider himself a conservative? What were his life experiences? What were the things that happened that shaped that point of view? And then I would do the same. And we sat there for an hour and talked about where these things come from for us, where our ideas took shape and why, and didn't have any sort of exchange about the difference in our political outcomes, our political points of view, other than to say that we had them. And what that did was, Nolan and I had already known each other about a decade when we did this, but I don't think either of us knew that story about the other. I don't think either of us really understood why we ended up on, opposite poles politically. It allowed us to build a real trust, I think, between each other in terms of understanding that when we do get into an argument, when we do have a disagreement, which is frequently, we know where it's coming from. We know where the other person really sits and why they have come up with the ideas that they have. And so in a lot of our civility sessions, we ask the participants beforehand to do that. We ask them to pair up with members of their group who they don't necessarily agree with or don't know as much about, and spend time talking about where your ideas come from. Why are you a Republican? Why are you a Democrat? Why are you neither and an independent? What was it about your background and upbringing that brought you there? And that had a lot to do with the sort of formation of this project as well, that once we did that, it really opened up the idea that this was a way for people to have a different kind of experience and a different kind of interaction over politics. If you can remove the charge of unfamiliarity, if you can move the power of distrust and replace it with trust, it's a lot easier to talk to somebody and even argue with somebody as we do, and not end up saying, well, that's not something I'm going to do again. That's not somebody I can have that interaction with, and I'm going to go back to my circles where everybody agrees with me.
It's a really good point. And in fact, Janice added a comment in the chat that I'd like to share, and then it sort of leads us into our conversation about some special situations and unusual times.
Yeah.
And she said, I have phone banked since 1976 for presidential elections. The types of comments people have said to me this year are horrific. Calls, of course, are anonymous, but I saw the names of who I was calling. I called a young woman who was in my Sunday school class. She told me to F off when I asked if she was voting for our governor. It hit me really hard. Would she have said this if she had known it was me? And I think that's a good point. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I think that's an excellent point. One, you obviously didn't do that good a job with your Sunday school lessons, but that anonymity and the perceived anonymity of social media, even though you're not really anonymous, brings out the worst in people. I see comments on Twitter from people I've long considered my friends commenting about my work and in a very personal, hateful manner. And I'm thinking, what in the hell? I mean, we know each other. And, the internet is really, I think, an enabler of incivility. Obviously, it's a powerful tool for communication and for connectivity, but it's also an enabler of our worst instincts. And people behave so poorly and get rewarded for behaving poorly on social media. I really think it's one of the drivers of the intensifying of our divisions and incivility, because it invites people to break up into camps and fire at each other.
Yeah, and like Nolan said, it's not just that social media encourages it, right? Social media encourages a brand of incivility like nothing we've seen before, and for me, that's kind of captured best in the whole idea of blocking someone, right? How many times we see people block other people on social media, and not just do it, but celebrate it publicly. I blocked this person. I'm not talking to that person anymore, and then that post gets all kinds of attention. Or you tell someone off on social media and post an exchange that's uncivil and say, I told this person really good, and everybody claps and cheers. And the social currency of social media is incivility in so many ways, especially when it comes to politics. The 24-hour cable news cycle, I think, is another real presence in our culture that reinforces a lot of the same ideas. First of all, the idea that there is 24-hour news is absurd. There isn't. There wasn't 20 years ago, and there isn't now. But the need to fill airtime all day, every day, really drives them to the idea of conflict as a way of keeping you from turning the dial. And the conflict, because there isn't much to talk about much of the time, you've got to invent conflict for people to get into it over. And the talking over people, the shouting at people, the insults, the more that happens, the more, I guess, ratings go up, and it kind of self-reinforces to the point where the whole purpose is being uncivil. And so it is really difficult. It is really difficult right now, I think, or maybe more difficult than ever, to swim in the other direction, to say, I don't want to be part of that. I would rather have a genuine exchange with somebody, even if it's passionate, even if it reflects some very strong feelings on my part, and not have it mean that the relationship I have with the person that I'm talking to is going to be ruined. I think the most dramatic example we've had this year, frankly, of the level of incivility that is present and accepted right now is the state of the presidential debates. I mean, the first debate was absurd. It was not any sort of actual substantive exchange. I mean, the moderator had no real control over what was going on. You had people talking over each other. You had people insulting each other. We had to cancel the second debate because the president was sick. But the debate tomorrow, which we should maybe open up a pool. I don't think the debate tomorrow is actually going to happen. I don't see any way that this will actually occur. But if it does, think of what the setting for it is. They're going to have a mute button for both candidates, and when they need to, instead of telling people to stop talking, they're just going to cut them off. Now, we've had presidential debates in this country for every election since 1960. We have never had a need to mute candidates, to frame the debate with a mute button. I mean, it really is symbolic, I think, of just how badly we are off the rails in terms of just being able to talk to one another. And these are two guys who know each other. These are two guys who have had exchanges in the past, but it's the time and the context that they're in that has driven everybody to this extreme where normal discourse can't even be assumed that it will take place.
So we have had some really extenuating circumstances this year, to say the least. We've had a global pandemic, a fraught political situation, which was only building. We've had intensifying of race struggles and just tons of things exploding. And then, of course, you mentioned social media. So all of these things are happening at the same time. And then they introduce economic anxiety, all kinds of fears.
Yeah.
So it already may be hard to build civility in a normal time. But in a year like this, where we have the perfect storm of everything happening at once, I mean, is it worth it? How do we do it? How do we handle civility in a time like this?
Well, it's essential. It's not easy, particularly this isolation that COVID has forced on us. You're even more sort of packed into your own social circles, the people who you are comfortable talking with and who share your beliefs and your values and your opinions. And so that all gets reinforced, and you're not out as much being exposed to other people and having those encounters that would sort of to engage in meaningful intellectual discussion. So the isolation of this has put people also on edge. People are very touchy, and when they do get out of the house, they drive like absolute idiots, I think, because and that fuels more hard feelings among people. But it's been hard, and then people have been affected different ways by this COVID crisis, so they develop different views about policy. Some people have lost friends and relatives and are older and very fearful of the pandemic. Other people have lost jobs and businesses, and they're looking at very dire economic situations in their homes and their families. That colors how they think and leads to a lot of passion on their part in reaction to policies that they see are more harmful than protective. And we always talk about the easy default is say, well, just follow the science, follow the data. But the science and data have changed almost on a weekly basis, and people are getting confused and frustrated. And I think a lot of folks had thought by now we'd be beyond this, and we're not. And we may be looking at a very hard stretch before we get beyond it as people move back indoors. So anxiety, fear, hardship, all fuels the tensions that lead to uncivil interactions.
Stephen, do you have any suggestions for how we can go about building civility in this time? And, you know, we have all of these issues. We have the political landscape, we have the pandemic, and we also have racial turmoil. And so what are some suggestions that you or Nolan might have to take steps toward still fighting the good fight and building civility at this time?
Yeah, I think obviously it's harder because of the things that are going on, but all of these things also give us an opportunity to try to do things differently. And when we talk about civility, we talk about some core principles that we like to sort of share with people about how and why you can go into these kinds of interactions in a way that kind of avoids the worst parts of human exchanges. And the first thing we talk about, the first principle we talk about, is listening. And when we say listening, we mean something a little different than I think the popular definition of that word suggests. I think for a lot of us, when we say we're listening, we just mean we're not talking, that we're allowing somebody else to talk. But while they're talking, we might be in our own heads thinking about what we're going to say as soon as that person stops talking. We might be thinking about what that person is saying and judging what they're saying and making conclusions about that person based on what they're saying. But we're not really listening. When we talk about listening, we're talking about active listening, really shutting down the voices inside your own head and trying to understand not just what the other person is saying, but why they may believe this. Like, what is it about them that attracts them to this point of view, even if it's a point of view that we don't agree with. It's really a hard sort of purposeful thing to have to do. I don't think it's a natural human instinct. We have to kind of force ourselves to give a little bit more of the benefit of the doubt to somebody that we're having an argument with. But once you are able to do that kind of listening, I think you're able also to have an exchange with somebody that's a little more empathetic, that's a little more acknowledging of the legitimacy of where this other person is coming from, even if you don't think what they're saying is itself something you agree with or even put any stock in. Another principle we talk about, again, is this idea of investing in the exchange itself, having a sense that there's a value to talking with somebody who you don't agree with and wanting to learn about what their point of view actually is, not because you plan to change your mind, but because we're all better off for in the things that we do believe, for understanding what the flip side is. I can't tell you how many times Nolan and I have had disagreements, and neither one of us changes our position as a result of that disagreement. But both of us, I think, understand our own point of view a lot better for knowing what the flip side argument is. And sometimes you may attenuate your position a little bit to account for something that you heard that the other person said. There's a value in that I think you have to sort of lift up when you want to sort of have an exchange with somebody that you don't agree with. You have to feel like there is something worth learning about this opposite point of view, even if it's something that you just don't agree with at all, or even if you find it offensive, when it's even tougher to do that. There is a sort of existential value that you place on the exchange itself. And then the other principle we talk about is not walking away from the table, or at least not walking away for good. Not ever reaching the point where you say, I'm done with this person. I am not going to have this conversation. I am not going to exchange in debate with this person anymore. The thing that social media encourages us to do, you have to resist that and say, yeah, there are times when I'm going to be upset because I'm talking to somebody who's saying things that I don't agree with and that I find emotionally difficult to stomach. There are going to be times when we're going to have arguments. We call this the Civility project, but I think a lot of people who would watch Nolan and I on television or in person debate things would wonder where that word really is in the exchange. I mean, this is not an attempt to soften disagreements or to avoid tough subjects. I mean, when we really have a disagreement, we get after each other, and there is a lot of passion a lot of times, and there's some bitterness sometimes. But when we're finished each time, I don't think either of us has ever gotten up from the table or wherever we are and said, I'm done. I'm not talking to that guy anymore. I don't want to do this. We always say that again, the value of the exchange is what got us there, and that's what will bring us. That's what will bring us back. That doesn't mean that there aren't times that you reach a point in a given conversation where there's no more point in having the discussion,
Yeah.
right? Where there's no opportunity really to have a productive understanding. And so then you say, well, look, let's not talk about this right now. There are a lot of things right now that I think it's very difficult to talk about all the time because we're all so emotionally racked by the things that are happening around us. But we always come back. We always go and say, when is the next argument? When is the next opportunity to have this exchange? Because I have a sense of value for not what the other person is saying, but understanding what they're saying and where they're coming from.
Lynn, I would reinforce that by just saying a conversation is not a competition. Don't go into it thinking, man, I've got to win. I've really got to destroy that other person's argument. I've got to convert that other person. No point having the conversation. It's not going to happen. As Steve said, go in with the honest goal of trying to understand the other person's position and perhaps even learning something from it. But don't go in thinking, I'm with this smug, self-righteous attitude that I'm right and you're wrong and I'm going to prove it to you. That almost never works. You either get into a shouting match or the other person shuts down, and that's not healthy. So set an honest goal for the conversation.
So Jody has been waiting so patiently, and I really appreciate that. Because he said, isn't there a bottom line for discussion and topics about which we need not engage? Perhaps we're witnessing the bottom now. And I'd like to add to that, that there may, asking you, is there a bottom line for topics that we should avoid? And also, are there people sometimes that you choose not to engage with? So topics and people, what are your thoughts?
I would just say, it depends on the situation and where you are at with the other person. I tend to think there is no bottom, particularly in the times we're in now. We need to be talking and we need to be trying to understand each other on even the most contentious issues. And we do take the time to do the things Steve and I are talking about, understand each other, build trust in each other, and then we can talk. We may never reach an agreement, but we may progress towards some common point and some healthier point than simply avoiding each other.
Yeah, I mean, so if you think about the things that have gone on this year and the problems that I think have drawn new attention, I mean, these are foundational issues in this country, especially the incredible movement that has grown up around Black Lives Matter and the pushback against police brutality and systemic racism. I mean, this is stuff that goes all the way back to the founding in this country. And part of the reason that we have been unable to resolve all of it, and I won't say that we haven't resolved any of it. I mean, there's been enormous change over the 240 some years that the country has been around. But the matters that remain unresolved are a function of the inability to actually be able to work across political or ideological lines to come up with solutions. And that doesn't mean that there isn't a place for extreme demonstration on one side or another. I mean, the protests that are happening in the streets, I think, need to be there. They need to be large, they need to be loud, and they need to make it clear that that it's time for all of this to end, that we need another fundamental change in this country in the way that we deal with these issues. But to get to that place, we can't do it in the streets. You're not going to solve this that way. This will get solved with people from a number of different points of view sitting down and figuring out what the path forward looks like. And that is what the Republic was built on. We have all of the mechanisms at our disposal in this country to be able to do that, and to be able to do that in a way that's different from other countries. Most countries on the planet, that kind of change comes about one way, and it's through conflict and violence. I mean, we see that all the time on this planet. The charm of this country is that we have a republic that affords us every opportunity to do it a different way. And shame on us if we can't figure out how to do that. You've got to lean into these issues, get through the contention, and get to the point where there's enough people around the table who agree on the idea of change to come up with what that change ought to look like.
You can't get too comfortable with the status quo. You can't be looking at your own situation and say, things are great, so things are great in the country. You've got to realize that, things are never great for everybody. And the goal should be to making sure things are great for everybody, because that is possible. And that comes out of the first thing we talked about, trying to figure out the things that shaped the other person's experiences, the things that are still troubling them and their lives, even though, you might look across and say, they look like they're doing just like me, and not understanding all of the layers of the things that they may be dealing with, that they might be facing, that you don't face. That only comes through conversation.
So Karen has asked a really interesting question, and I can't wait to hear the answer. She wants to know if the two of you have a view that has been altered by talking or listening with the other. So, maybe it's for each of you to respond.
I'm sure there have. I mean, I've always started out with this idea that I could be wrong. I never want to get so smug in my opinions that I think I'm the only one who talks to God, to God. I think certainly on, racial issues, there's been some knowledge gained that perhaps I didn't have when I was only, looking at my own situation as a kid born in Appalachia to very poor parents, thinking my struggle was the same as other struggles, and they're different, and we need to understand that difference. And so I think on issues, there's a lot of issues where I've honed my position, perhaps, maybe not changed it. So
yeah, I mean, so the goal of this is not for one of us to change the other's opinion. I mean, I think that's actually a non-productive framework. I mean, there isn't a point in having the exchange if that's the goal, because well, to be honest, those of us who have strong opinions about these things come to them through a lifetime of experiences. It would be unusual, I think, to expect that we would change our minds about these things. At the same time, I think there again is an inherent value in the exchange itself, because one of us will say something to the other that the other hadn't thought of, and I think that happens all the time in the exchanges that Nolan and I have. He doesn't ever surprise me with the position he takes on an issue, but the way he gets there or the reasons that he has for holding that opinion surprise me all the time. Or he'll share some understanding of it that I didn't have, and that's the goal, I think, is that somebody who thinks about these things in a fundamentally different way has got all kinds of knowledge and thinking in their head that's not in yours, and you come out better prepared, I think, to state and defend your own positions if you understand what the other side looks like and how they think. And so we get this question pretty frequently, and I can't think of too many things over the last 12 years, other than some maybe minor stuff that maybe one of us changed our minds about. But I think if you looked at both of our work and the way that we go about things, I mean, it's really affected by things that the other says. It's really changed sometimes in tone or substance by the thinking that the other has shared about why they believe what they believe. And so in that way, I think you see the effect far more dramatically.
So, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that we're talking with a bunch of educators here.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, in the past week, our session last week was with the Kessler Scholars, which is an opportunity for first generation college students to go to some pretty impressive universities. And so we were actually doing a session with the students. And so education has really been a big focus of our discussions lately. And I wonder if you guys might touch on the idea of the role of education in building civility.
Well, I think schools, classrooms, colleges should be laboratories for the exchange of ideas and for civility and some civil discussions. I think the earlier people can learn to do this and engage. That's why I worry when, the sort of the movement we're seeing recently to shut people down, to cancel people, to say, you can't say that. I'm of a mind that almost anything ought to be said so that it can be brought out into the sunlight, debated, discredited if necessary. I think ideas that are shut down, speech that is shut down, just goes underground and festers. And we saw that here in Michigan in the worst way with a kidnapping plot against our governor by people who felt they were so disenfranchised they had to do something desperate, or perhaps they were just crazy. I don't know. But I think this idea of a liberal education is to encourage a vigorous exchange of ideas. And we had some students last week express that desire and it was very encouraging to hear them to talk about the benefits they're receiving from having exchanges with people who are different from them, think differently from them. I think we want to keep that alive and active in our classrooms at every level and not be so afraid that somebody might say the wrong thing.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about schools, K-12 and college are the training grounds for these kinds of exchanges. It's where we learn how to do this, or it's where we're supposed to learn how to do this. In high school, I can remember being really involved in Model United Nations and debate and things like that. And those were really key experiences to learning, again, the value of opposite and different points of view, and learning how to stand in and say what you think and defend your position in the face of opposition that sometimes made you uncomfortable, or sometimes made you really upset about what somebody thought. In college, what I remember most dramatically, I started college at the University of Michigan in 1988. And that was the era of speech codes on college campuses. The administrations were passing codes that tried to regulate student speech. And, that was a fascinating time on those campuses for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons was the agreement on much of the right and left that this was not okay. It wasn't just liberal students who were going to be the victims, frankly, of the speech code. They certainly were passing those codes to try to tamp down on the protests that had really sprung up in the mid to late 1980s on college campuses. But you had a lot of conservative students also saying, hey, you know what, this doesn't make any sense. The whole idea of a college campus is this exchange, and there were lots of opportunities to learn, for me, about the conservative arguments against speech codes and things like that. And so I think for most of us, this is where that foundation gets laid for being able to say, I understand that people have differences, and I understand the value of exchanging over those differences and not shutting people down, except in the most extreme and violent instances. These people here in Michigan who wanted to kidnap the governor weren't upset about not being able to say anything. They did. They went out to the Capitol and marched around with guns. They went into the Capitol with guns. These are people who felt like they wanted to impose their way on everybody else through any means necessary, including the most violent thing they could have done to our governor. So I'm not sure that was about speech, which they had plenty of. It was about sense, which they didn't have enough of.
So we have a few really good comments that I want to get in our last 10 minutes. I do want to mention, on the heels of what Stephen and Nolan just said, there's a great podcast called Nice White Parents, which was a series about a school in Brooklyn, and it looked at how educational reform is made. And there was a question that has stayed with me ever since, and it was, what is the goal of public education? And I know we could probably spend hours on that, and so we won't tonight, but one of the answers from, it was either the 1950s or 1960s, was to teach democratic values. And so that's interesting. And again, we don't want to touch it. We have so much more to talk about, but check it out, because it's something to really chew on. So I just want to mention, Stephen Lalonde said, the lack of civility has been so modeled by many in the leadership of this country, which gives permission for incivility. So I think maybe spend a couple of minutes on that so we can get in the last two comments in the chat as well.
Well, yeah, I would agree with that. We've had poor examples from our leadership, but we can't shake our own responsibility. We can't shirk our own responsibility. We don't have to follow the lead, and we don't have to say, well, the president says this, so I can say that, and I get so tired of people defending bad behavior by saying, yeah, but what about the president? We know better than that. And I think we should not follow, either as children or as adults, bad examples.
Yeah, well, we got to stop rewarding those bad examples too. Again, social media and cable news thrive off of this stuff, and to some extent, we're responsible for that. We keep watching cable news when there's shouting match after shouting match. We keep going back to these forums that social media has created when the most brutal kinds of things are said and done, and again, the shutting down of people. I have a little more faith in the potential for social media. I mean, I see social media as, a communication tool primarily. And if you think about it, each communication tool that has come along in the history of the country has experienced this same period of, early turmoil and danger. I mean, the telegraph, when it was invented, was used largely for misinformation in the lead up to the Civil War. I mean, a lot of the tensions around slavery and North versus South were fomented by fake telegrams that people would send about what was going on in Washington. The radio, television, their early days were really fraught with misinformation. And you think about their value today, how they have matured. I think social media has more potential than those to do that, because it's a medium that we all control individually in a way that we didn't with those others. But it is in its infancy really showing some petulance and problematic behavior that we have the power to sort of push in the other direction. And I'm sort of eagerly waiting for the examples of that to start cropping up. I don't know whether it's different platforms, like is there something other than Facebook or Twitter that will emerge as a more mature way to do that, or whether those platforms themselves will get reformed by the people who are on them. But that's got to be one of the goals, is to take this tool and make it actually work for common public understanding, reasonable exchange and learning. And right now it doesn't do that.
So we have a few comments that I'd love to share. Sandy mentioned a workshop on decision making where it was expressed that the difference between the Japanese approach and the American approach was that the Japanese spent 80% of the time defining the problem and 20% of the time finding the solution. And for Americans, the numbers were the reverse. So the result is that we were solving the same problem over and over again because the focus was unbalanced. Sharon asked, how do we deal with total untruths? Could you spend maybe just a couple of minutes talking about that?
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Steve. No, go ahead.
I mean, I'm someone who thinks you got to call that stuff out when it happens, and not give it any quarter, and call it out with fact. I mean, falsehoods aren't opinions. They aren't part of the reasonable scope of discourse, and it's up to each of us, I think, when we encounter that, to make sure to counter it with truth. I mean, there is an incredible effort in this country, largely inspired by foreign influences right now, to mislead people about our elections, to mislead people about the issues that we're struggling with, and there's nothing more dangerous than that kind of effort. I mean, it threatens the very bounds of the discussions that we're trying to have. You cannot have reasonable discourse if there is not an adherence to and reverence for fact and truth. And it's harder and harder the more that the influences that are peddling this stuff put it out there. It's really easy now, much easier than it used to be, to spread misinformation, to say something that's untrue and see it, catch fire all around the world in just a few minutes. So I just don't have I just have no patience for it. And I think none of us can. We all have to be able to say, that's not true. Here's how I can show you it's not true. And this has got to spread as widely and quickly as the untruth.
Make sure you know that you, when you're dealing with truth and when you're dealing with not, it's going to be harder and harder to discern. Technology is going to make deception, is already making deception extraordinarily easy. In future presidential elections, you're going to be watching a candidate on a political ad on social media, words coming out of his or her mouth that were never spoken. That technology exists today, and I've sat through sessions on it where I couldn't tell whether, what was real and what wasn't real. So just make sure you know what's true rather than assuming because there are a lot of people out there engaged in deception.
So I'm sure we could go on and on, but we are hitting up against our end time. I want to thank everybody for all of their comments in the chat. There was a lot to think about. And I think what we can close with is that Jody mentioned about debates held in his classroom, that there was an emphasis on topics that reasonable people could tackle, and there were ground rules and there were boundaries. And I think that that's a really good point, because when we start with certain standards and shared expectations, we have a lot more success in civil conversations and building civility overall. So I do want to thank the WEA retired chapter for inviting us. It's been really wonderful to speak with all of you, and I love that you included this in your board meeting. I hope that we'll have the opportunity to connect with you again. And again, thank you so much for inviting the Civility Project out to your neck of the woods.
Thank
you
you
all.
very much. We really appreciate it. It was
Thank
wonderful
you.
to see you from the Great Lakes area.
Come see us.
I have. I went to all 50 states, and Michigan was right up there.
Oh, really? Very cool.
That was
Thank
one of
you,
my
everyone.
values. Thank you.
And
so
Mary,
much.
will you send me the recording when you have a chance?
Yes, Brooke will. Yeah,
Perfect.
great.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks
Have a
very
great
much.
evening. Great evening. Thank you.